Superannuation was one of the greatest economic decisions an Australian Prime Minister has ever made. It made sense it came from the mind of Bob Hawke and pushed through by someone like Paul Keating. It's not an easy sell to say, hey, we're going to force this country to set aside income for retirement. And as of 2025, it's 12% of your gross income. It's a gold mine of a policy, in my opinion. It's an almost certain guarantee that you'll be supported during retirement. And if you wanted, you could even contribute more than that 12%. You can add up to $30,000 a year, and that would only be taxed at a rate of 15%. Which for most Aussies means it's taxed lower than their income. It's a safe and pretty decent investment, with your super increasing roughly 6.3% on average over 5 years, and 8% over 15 years. On average, when you hit that age bracket of 55 to 74, you'll have between $326,000 to $436,000. That is, unless you're a woman, but we'll get into that later. From the moment you get a job, money is going into your super, and it is locked there until you're 60. But if Peter Dutton, the current leader of the Liberal Party, is elected, that all might change. He believes allowing young people to dip into their super will open up the housing market to young Australians, allowing them to get their foot in the door. But in my opinion, it is simply smoke and mirrors, kicking the can down the road, and I hope I can show you this country is doing the same. Throughout this section, we're going to be doing some napkin maths. You know when you sit down at the bar and just throw some vaguely accurate numbers out there when you're planning something with your mates? I'm going to be doing a lot of that, but I did try and ground it in reality, and I think it's pretty fair and gets the point across. Dutton wants to allow people to use up to 40% of their super, or up to $50,000 to access the property market. Now, he mentioned protections in place to ensure that home buyers who dipped into their super would eventually have to return the money, but we don't exactly know what that looks like. And every year that money isn't in your super, that's interest lost. Let's start with a pretty vital question in assessing this decision. Will this policy even get people into homes? About 50% of the Australian rental market is 22 to 44-year-olds, and young Australians are disproportionately feeling this housing hell, so we're going to ground a lot of these examples in that younger age bracket. So, we're talking about superannuations anywhere between a total of 6.5 to 107,000, or usable amounts between $2,500 and $50,000 with that 40% or $50,000 limit. Unless, again, you're a woman, but I'm sure we'll talk about that later. The median house price in Sydney is 1.6 million. Canberra, it's 1.05. Melbourne, it's 1.03. Brisbane, it's 924,000. Adelaide, it's 902. Perth, it's 780. And Darwin, it's 573. Units ain't much better, with Sydney at 806, Melbourne at 564, Brisbane at 549, Adelaide at 590, Canberra 565, Perth at 425, and Darwin at 387,000. Ideally, you'd like to be paying 20% of the full value of the property as a deposit. That would mean for Sydney, it's 320, Canberra it's 210, Melbourne it's 206, Brisbane it's 184, Adelaide it's 180, Perth it's 156, and Darwin it's 114 for a house deposit. For units, it would be Sydney at 161, Canberra at 113, Melbourne at 112, Brisbane at 109, Adelaide at 98, Perth at 85, and Darwin at 77. So far, the amount you can take from your super can't even cover a deposit. Now, some of you are going to think I'm being unfair. People are going to be combining their super with their additional savings, you say, which is fair, I guess, but let's actually take a look. Between the ages of 15 to 44, Aussies are making between 40 and 104,000, unless you're a woman. Can we just again push that to the side temporarily? I promise we'll deal with it later. Between the ages of 18 to 41, there is roughly between 27,000 and 35,000 in Aussies savings. So, including their super, they could have a deposit anywhere between 29.5 and 85,000 if they raid their entire savings, which is still significantly under that 20% for major cities. For the purpose of this next example, we're going to use New South Wales. Let's say you're desperate for a house. You can take out a loan that is 80% more of the bank's valuation of your property. You just then also need lender's mortgage insurance. But then that means you only need to pay 5% of the property value as a deposit. Let's be clear though, lender's mortgage insurance isn't for you. It protects the bank if you can't pay back the mortgage, and that lender's mortgage insurance cost is added to your mortgage with the bank. To be exceptionally clear, if you can't pay the mortgage, you're paying for the bank to get their money back, not you. But hey, that only matters if you can't pay for the mortgage, and with that 5% deposit, that means you only need to borrow 95% of the valuation. You're 25, you make 83k a year, let's do it, you say. You only then need to pay $2,181 a week. Oh, that's $113,412 a year. But that's disingenuous, I hear you say. A 25-year-old could get a unit instead, which is true. That would work out to be $1,099 a week, or $57,148 a year. Keeping in mind also that 83k becomes $64,000 after tax. So we're talking about 89% of the income going to that mortgage. And also, we didn't include the cost of that lender's mortgage insurance and stamp duty, which is around $146,000. Stamp duty is a tax on top of all of this, but to be fair, in New South Wales at least, it's waived for first home loan buyers. We could run these numbers again if you wanted to make it a two-person household, but the median age of marriage is 31 to 32, and I'm not sure going into property with a partner or mate is the best call, although theoretically it could assist with the issue, unless you're a woman. Then it's more complicated, but we'll get into that. We could also move them up an income bracket, but at that point, we're ignoring the fact that most Aussies in their 20s aren't making 100k. The reality is everyone is going to have different incomes and savings and opportunity and cost, and I haven't even mentioned the bank of mum and dad. And I also suck at maths. I needed a tutor for maths general, but I think the point stands. Even with the ability to dip into super, housing prices are out of the reach of young Australians, and this policy does not meaningfully help. This policy could actually make it significantly worse, with some experts publishing a model suggesting that median house prices in major capital cities could jump 9% or $75,000. That means that 50k couldn't even cover the jump. Look, if you're interested in doing this for an investment, taking claim of that juicy negative gearing tax benefit if you already own a home and hoping to ride the wave that led to houses increasing 453% and units increasing 307% over 30 years, take the risk, I guess, but let's be clear. It is a risk, and I don't want to hear you begging for government payouts. Super is effectively guaranteed, and the housing market is thankfully slowing, with the national home value easing to 6% as of November 1st, 2024, down from 6.7%. Delinquency rates, the rate at which people can't pay their mortgage, are increasing too. People can't afford to keep their homes, and some people can't even afford to pay rent at the moment, meaning even those with investment properties aren't able to pay the mortgage because they're solely relying on tenants' income. There's a good chance right now if you try and buy and sell a unit or home for profit, you'll end up losing money. It's safer and smarter to keep your money in super. It'll be better for you in the long run. The risk isn't worth it, and the vast majority of young Aussies do not have the income to even use housing as intended, let alone as an investment. And that's really the video. There's the facts. For the average renter, this is not going to meaningfully help. It might actually lead to property price increases rather than decreases. And taking money out of super loses you interest. The amount extracted from super won't be enough for a down payment or meaningfully financial help. 50k in super is smarter and safer than in the property market. Look, if you made it to the end, thank you. Check out the other videos. Oh, yeah. That point about women, I just kept putting it off. Okay, bear with me. I gotta find the numbers. There's roughly a 25% difference in the super between men and women when they reach 60 to 64. Yeah, damn, that sucks. There's roughly a 22% earning difference between men and women. Yeah, that also sucks. Someone should eventually fix that. In 2021 to 2022, 16% of the 4.1 million Australians who experienced partner violence experienced economic abuse. Of the 108,000 specialist homelessness service clients in 2021 to 2022, 39% of all the clients experienced family and domestic violence. In 2023, 58 women were victims of domestic homicide, and that's up from 33 in 2021 and 35 in 2022. In New South Wales since 2000, of the 550 domestic violence context homicides, 331 were women. Oh, maybe we shouldn't have kept kicking that can down the road for so long. For those who now haven't immediately clicked off the video, welcome to the second half of the video. We've got a housing issue in this country. I don't deny it. That's important. We've also got an issue with what's happening within those homes, and it's one of the many reasons why housing affordability is really important and why Dutton's policy sucks. On average, a woman is killed every 9 days by a current or former partner. People don't like hearing those quick stats or phrases. It makes them very uncomfortable, and they try and diminish them. There's many videos trying to misrepresent murder rates by ignoring per capita statistics or hand-waving the issue because overall murder rates across the board are trending downwards and fluctuations are normal. We can go back and forth on statistics all we want, but the cut and dry fact is, there has been an increase in the number of women murdered in Australia by their partners, and the moment we accept normal fluctuations, we've placed ourselves in a horrible position. In 2022 to 2023, 16% of homicide incidents were intimate partner homicides, and 89% of those were perpetuated against female victims. There was a 28% increase in intimate partner homicides from 0.25 per 100,000 to 0.32 per 100,000. And for Indigenous women overall, the murder rate was 3.07 per 100,000 compared to 0.45 for non-Indigenous women. There's the numbers. Take them in. Feel uncomfortable? You should. Housing is often talked about in this macro conversation about the Australian dream, wanting to have a home to call your own, a backyard, a pool for the kids. I feel as though we often lose sight of why financial strength in housing, especially independent financial strength in housing, is so-called the greatest welfare by some. You're not reliant on anyone. You can back and support yourself. You can more easily leave an abusive situation. I say more safely because unfortunately, it's rarely ever entirely safe. So how did we get into this position where women can become economically controlled by abusive men? One component is the variation in domestic labor and career opportunities. Starting a family is a huge risk. In fact, women are at an increased risk of experiencing violence from an intimate partner during pregnancy. If it's already occurring, it is likely to increase in severity. On top of that, women bear the brunt of the economic loss. They lose out on the work, the promotions, and the career opportunities afforded to men. All of that time off work is money that is not going into super or savings. During pregnancy, they are relying on a partner's income or have to raid their savings. If abuse occurs during this period, what economic means does someone have to escape? If one was able to work during or prior to pregnancy, there's paid parental leave, but that's only after the child is born. And if someone wasn't working prior to becoming pregnant, being a stay-at-home wife for instance, they might not even be eligible. Even if they were a casual worker, if they were working less than once a week, they also might not be eligible. Even after that child is born, someone has to take care of it, and it's usually the woman. According to Fawcett, 249,123 working mothers with children under 4 left work due to the difficulty of raising children. 1 in 5 had considered leaving, and 1 in 10 had handed in notice. In another survey, 80% of mothers left the full-time workforce within 3 years of having their first child. 19% left altogether. What security does that stay-at-home mother now have? Financial independence is taken away, and with that, the ability to leave and house themselves and their child if the situation becomes unsafe. But let's say they do find somewhere to escape their abuser. How do we protect them? In New South Wales, there's something called an apprehended violence order, or AVO for short. They are court-ordered protections against the defendant to not engage in actions against a victim. Think of it like a stop sign. Some of you already see where this is going. An apprehended domestic violence order, ADVO, is an AVO used to protect a person against someone who they had a domestic relationship with. An ADVO operates nationally, meaning no matter where you are in Australia, they have to comply. How would someone actually get an AVO? One way is the police are called to a domestic disturbance and they fear for someone's safety and give a provisional AVO. The defendant is then served the AVO application and they either consent to the AVO, which can be done without admitting wrongdoing, and the AVO is put in place, or they don't consent and it goes to court. But there is a chance the victim gets an interim AVO until the court date. Once a date is organized, there is a hearing where a magistrate listens to evidence, and if satisfied there are fears for safety and those fears are reasonable, or the defendant doesn't show up to court, you can get an AVO. The court can also reject an AVO, however, if they believe it has no reasonable chance of success, is frivolous, or vexatious. The AVO can have a number of conditions present. It will always have conditions that stop the defendant from assaulting or threatening, stalking, harassing or intimidating, and intentionally or recklessly destroying or damaging property, or harming animals that belong to you or are with you. Other conditions may include stopping the defendant approaching or contacting you, going near your home home or work, approaching or being in your company after drinking or taking illegal drugs, trying to find you, or any other condition that the court might think is necessary. In situations where someone may be living with their abuser, they may get a property recovery order where police assist by coming to the home and allowing the victim to get their things, or allowing the defendant to get their things and move away. These AVOs last around 12 to 24 months, with the number of AVOs increasing year after year, with 101,170 AVOs in place in Q3 of 2024. 98% of domestic AVOs are applied for by the police, with 1% initiated by members of the public, with only around 40% of the AVOs given, restricting the offender from having any contact with a protected person. So, reasonable follow-up question: how effective are they? So when it comes to breaches, 4% of AVOs were breached within the previous 3 months. That's pretty good. However, 20.7% of AVOs had been breached. In New South Wales, when it came to ADVOs, it's pretty horrible. In 2023, 39,814 ADVOs were issued. 22,969 breaches occurred. So reasonably, you ask what happens if the defendant breaches the AVO. If reported, they can be arrested and charged with said breach and any other crime they commit during the breach. But that relies on the ADVO breach being reported. So if apprehended, they might be refused bail and kept in custody, or simply released on bail with or without conditions. About 38% of AVO breaches resulted in good behaviour bonds between 14 to 16 months. A good behaviour bond is sentencing orders that require an offender to abide by conditions or they may be resentenced. Around 17.8% resulted in fines, with an average of $432, and around 12.4% were sentenced to imprisonment. It's complicated to say how effective AVOs are. There's a big debate at the moment. Boxar's Director of Research, Dr. Don Weatherburn, expressed that the high breach rate doesn't make domestic ADVOs a failure. In fact, studies by the Bureau have found that the vast majority of women reported a sizable and sustained drop in incidents of stalking, intimidation, and violence after obtaining an order. ADVOs were not a miracle cure, he said, but in 4 out of 5 cases, they put a stop to the violence, intimidation, and harassment. One study noted longer ADVOs were associated with a reduction in DV offending between 41 and 59%. However, only in the 12-month period when just the 24-month order was active, and said analysis also showed that the breach rate was between 79 and 161% higher than those with shorter AVDOs. We can look at real-world examples and see some major issues. In 2024, a woman's body was found in Belmore. She allegedly had an AVO in place against the man who allegedly killed her. Here's another example of a woman killed when there was an AVO in place. Here's another. In this case, no one even showed up to the court dates for this woman's ADVO. I wish there was a clean answer to the effectiveness of AVDOs, but the fact is sometimes they're amazing, and sometimes they're not worth the paper they're printed on. It's like a stop sign. Is it a crowded street in the middle of the day, or are you the only one on a road in the middle of the night? Outside of AVDOs, what happens when domestic violence cases make it to court? Regarding criminal charges, in 2023, there was a 7% increase in finalized court appearances involving domestic violence, partially up, however, from the COVID catch-up. 60% had a charge proven, 26% had all charges withdrawn, 8% had no proven charges, and 6% had other outcomes. If found guilty, 42% received an unsupervised community order, 34% received a supervised community order, and 11% were sentenced to prison with an average sentence of 7.4 months. The number of people sentenced to prison for DV assault, however, has decreased by 2.5% over 5 years. New South Wales has aggressively tightened bail laws for those charged with alleged serious domestic violence offences, forcing them to show cause for why they should not be detained. On top of that, domestic violence offenders who are granted bail will be electronically monitored around the clock using GPS tech. If someone enters a restricted zone such as a location near the victim's work or home, Corrective Services New South Wales are alerted and they involve the police. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. but it's a start. It was actually quite difficult to find data on the number of partners murdered when an AVO was in place, but I actually found some whilst editing this video. These orders, the ADVOs, were a feature in 2/3 of cases where a female homicide offender killed a male partner, and 2/5 of cases where a male homicide offender killed a female partner. The data consistently demonstrates that in the majority of cases, notwithstanding who was ultimately killed, these orders named the female party as the person in need of protection from their male intimate partner. This was the case in over half of the 21 cases where there was a current order between a female IPV homicide offender and the male partner she killed at the time of the homicide. In a similar proportion of cases where there was a historic domestic violence order between the parties, the female homicide offender had been named as the person in need of protection from the male partner she ultimately killed. This demonstrates that in over half of the cases where a female IPV homicide offender killed a male partner, there had been a reported history of domestic violence against the woman by her male partner, and there had been prior police or court intervention as a result of this violence. Domestic violence is something that is somehow always mentioned in this country, but never properly talked about in my opinion. It feels as though we hear the statistics or stories about women being murdered by their partners, hear politicians say it needs to change, and then it never really does. There's the New South Wales Domestic and Family Violence Plan, which has some great elements, a lot of increased funding to services, and goals to shift the zeitgeist about how men speak and interact with women. But is it enough? We probably need to have a really rough and honest conversation about the extent to which freedoms might need to be limited for those alleged to be engaging in serious domestic violence offences. Convicting someone without their day in court? Unacceptable. Ankle monitors and incredibly strict provisions until the court date? Maybe I could get more on board with that. During a parliamentary submission into domestic violence, you had a lot of groups come out and try and spread the false allegations narrative. One men's rights group said that police suspect 1 in 4 DV allegations are false, and magistrates suspect only 5% are genuine, which if we just use 5% of our brain, doesn't make sense. That would mean the real number of court outcomes should have been 1,023 convictions, and magistrates were being bamboozled the other 11,195 times. Another group tried to use language very interestingly and stated that 70% of cases were deemed false, when the actual language in the study says based on the best available evidence were deemed false. Evidence and court processes are complicated, and absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence. DV often is insidious, occurring in private, and in some cultures it is both so normalized and something which is not spoken about, meaning it is never reported or no one will come forward to testify, fearing they'll be ostracized or worse. Evidence suggests domestic violence is actually underreported. Do false allegations happen? Absolutely. Is it anywhere near the majority? Absolutely not. To summarize everything, don't raid your super. You'll need it for retirement, no matter male or female. But for women especially, every cent counts. Domestic violence is a horrific failure in this country, and especially in New South Wales, and it needs to be tackled aggressively. It can't be done through alienating and villainizing men, because then the men who need to get help won't get it, but it can't be solved by burying our heads in the sand and ignoring the fact this is a male issue. Sure, false allegations happen, but they're in the minority, and for every guy who says a man's worst fear is a false allegation, what do you think a woman's worst fear is?